At 4:11 in the morning, under a moonless sky stretched thin over the Sea of Azov, a single Hornet drone, flying with Starlink-stabilized comms and AI-assisted targeting roughly 150 kilometers behind the Russian line, found a fuel column on the R-280 highway and turned a 40-vehicle convoy into a kilometer of burning steel. That column was not lost. It was not delayed. It was annihilated. And with it, the last functioning artery feeding the largest concentration of Russian forces on occupied Ukrainian territory began to close. This is not a story about a convoy. This is not a story about a highway. This is not a story about a single dramatic strike that lit up the night sky over Zaporizhia Oblast. What you're about to watch is the case study that historians will use 20 years from now to teach young officers exactly how a modern military with no air force, no fleet, and no parity in artillery can systematically strangle a numerically superior occupying army using nothing but cheap aircraft, patient engineering, and a doctrine the Russians never bothered to read. Russia's land bridge to Crimea, the corridor the Kremlin spent $11.8 billion rebuilding, fortifying, and renaming, has been functionally destroyed. And the consequences for the roughly 1.5 million people living inside that occupied zone, including the bulk of Russia's southern grouping of forces, are not theoretical. They are arriving now by the hour. Let me walk you through what this actually means at the strategic level. I have spent decades studying how armies move, and I will tell you something the cable channels will not say with the clarity it deserves. An army that cannot resupply is not an army. It is a hostage population in uniform. And as of this week, that is precisely what Russia's southern grouping has become. Pull the lens back. To understand the magnitude of what just collapsed, you have to understand what the Russians believed they had built. After the Kerch Bridge was struck repeatedly between 2022 and 2025, after the truck bomb, after the underwater attack the SBU publicly claimed, after the storm damage in January 2026 that ripped through the protective barriers Russia had installed around the bridge supports, the Kremlin made a decision. They concluded correctly that the Kerch crossing was no longer a survivable single point of failure. So they did what large states with money and time do. They built redundancy. Between 2024 and 2026, according to Reuters reporting in March, Moscow allocated roughly $11.8 billion to construct what they branded the Azov Ring, a network of highways, rail spurs, and port facilities looping from southern Russia through occupied Mariupol, through Berdyansk, through Melitopol, and down into Crimea via Armyansk and Jankoy. The centerpiece of that network was the R-280, which the occupation authorities renamed the Novorossiya route, a deliberate piece of imperial nostalgia layered onto a piece of asphalt. The Russian theory was elegant and on paper correct. If the Kerch Bridge falls, the land bridge holds. If a road is cut, traffic reroutes. If a depot burns, supplies stage further back. No single point of failure, no decisive vulnerability, no possibility of a Ukrainian operation that could sever Crimea from the mainland. That was the assumption. That is the assumption that just died. Here's what mainstream framing is missing, and it matters enormously. The cable analyst will tell you Ukraine is hitting Russian logistics. That phrasing is technically true and strategically useless. Hitting logistics is what every army at war does. What Ukraine is doing is something categorically different. Ukraine is conducting battlefield air interdiction without an air force. Let that sink in for a moment. The doctrine of battlefield air interdiction, the systematic destruction of enemy supply, movement, and reinforcement before it reaches the front, and that was developed by the United States Air Force across the Second World War, Korea, Vietnam, and the Gulf. It required strike aircraft, suppression of enemy air defenses, electronic warfare packages, and tanker support. It cost billions. It required runways. Ukraine is now executing that exact doctrine with quadcopters that cost a few $1,000s each, with fixed-wing strike drones that can be assembled in a workshop, and with an AI-assisted system called the Hornet that, according to Forbes and CEPA, reporting from May 2026, can penetrate up to 150 kilometers behind Russian lines with Starlink-stabilized communications and target identification that does not require a human in the loop for the terminal phase. The first Russian mistake was not tactical, it was psychological. Moscow assumed that distance was protection. Moscow assumed that any target more than 40 or 50 kilometers behind the front line was effectively safe. That assumption governed where they parked their fuel tankers, where they staged their ammunition, where they routed their convoys, and where they billeted their replacement battalions. The Russian rear was built on the silent premise that the rear existed. As of May 2026, that premise is gone. Ukrainian government advisor Serhiy Sternenko publicly documented an FPV quadcopter strike at 102 kilometers, 63 miles behind the line. The Russian war blogger Rybar, writing on his own Telegram channel, said the quiet part out loud. His exact phrasing was that there is no rear anymore, and that movement on roads near the front had become, in his words, a lottery. When the enemy's own propagandists are publishing your strategic thesis for you, the war has entered a new phase, and it gets even more serious from here. On May 26, the 412th Nemesis Brigade of Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces issued a public statement on Telegram confirming that the R280, the spine of the Azov Ring, the highway that connects Mariupol to Melitopol to Simferopol, the BVV Akmri, and Nene Seikam, and Nene Fendibi, and Kerr, and Bini, and Deinstein, and Melindi, and me. Not slowed, not harassed, blocked. The Russian occupation administration was forced to restrict heavy equipment from using the highway. Convoys attempting to circumvent the strike zone by using dirt roads and field paths through the steppe were themselves hunted down and destroyed by drone teams that had clearly anticipated the workaround. The 412 publicly stated they were deploying what they described as secret strike wings, fixed-wing platforms not previously documented in open sources, built in close collaboration with a Ukrainian manufacturer specifically optimized for interdiction at operational depth. Read that sentence again. Ukraine has begun fielding bespoke aircraft designed not to win the front line but to dismantle the rear. That is the doctrinal signature of a military that has decided to win a war by collapsing its enemy's ability to fight rather than by matching its enemy gun for gun. The numbers tell the doctrinal story more clearly than any general's briefing could. Open source monitoring group Okogora documented more than 60 burned trucks and fuel tankers on the M14 and H20 highways across just 3 weeks ending in late May. Mapping analyst Clement Moulin counted more than 125 destroyed trucks far from the front line, with the bulk of those losses concentrated in May 2026 alone. And the Okogora analysts were honest about something most observers missed, and they can see and she and Draki Warpre. They estimated that this destruction represents only around 5% of total Russian military transport moving along those routes. That detail matters more than the destruction itself, because 5% attrition sustained on the arterial supply lines of a mechanized army at war is not a nuisance. It is a death sentence on a timeline. Let me explain why. A motor rifle division at full sustainment burns through fuel, ammunition, water, and food at rates that are not negotiable. The Russian southern grouping defending the Landbridge, occupied Zaporizhia, occupied Kherson, and Crimea itself requires, by conservative estimate, somewhere between 800 and 1,200 trucks per day of through traffic to maintain operational readiness. When 5% of that flow burns on the road, you do not lose 5% of your combat power. You lose the specific cargo that burned, and in a logistics network, the specific cargo matters. A fuel tanker is not a crate of socks. A munitions truck is not a load of rations. The Ukrainian targeting cells, according to an officer of the 1 Azov Corps drone group quoted publicly, have been explicit about this. Their stated doctrine, in the officer's own words, is that it's better for us to destroy 3 trucks delivering ammunition than the gun firing them, because that will be much more effective. Or Mekwer Enver Kenki Wanksfraid. That is not a slogan. That is Sun Tzu wearing a Ukrainian uniform. Pull the lens back further. The real question is not whether Ukraine can burn Russian trucks. Ukraine has been burning Russian trucks since 2022. The real question is whether Ukraine can sustain a campaign of operational depth interdiction long enough to force the strategic isolation of Crimea before Moscow develops effective countermeasures? And the answer, as of May 2026, is yes, and the reason is industrial. This matters enormously. The Hornet drone, the platform doing most of the work at the longer ranges, was first observed in the Kharkiv direction roughly a year ago. According to CEPA's reporting, those early Hornets were used selectively in small numbers by a handful of units. By May 2026, the platform has spread to multiple brigades across multiple sectors. Andriy Pelipenko of Ukraine's 419 Unmanned Systems Battalion confirmed publicly that several Ukrainian drone models have now secured Defense Ministry contracts, which means production is scaling under state guarantee. Say Andriy Ukrainian manufacturers are not waiting for permission. They are not waiting for Western approval. They are not waiting for Berlin or Washington to clear a target list. Pelipenko noted, with characteristic Ukrainian directness, that Western-supplied weapons come with restrictions, coordination requirements, target limitations, depth caps, while Ukrainian-made drones carry none of those constraints. The Ukrainian state has, in effect, built a parallel strike capability that operates outside the political throttle imposed by its allies. That capability is now eating the Russian land bridge alive. And here is the counterintuitive reveal that the surface coverage keeps missing. The Russians did not lose the land bridge because Ukraine got a new weapon. They lost it because they bet $11.8 billion on the wrong assumption about modern warfare. Moscow believed that redundancy in roads, rail, and port facilities would defeat a long-range strike campaign. They built the Azov Ring as a hedge against bridge strikes and missile attacks. They never imagined a swarm doctrine that did not care about redundancy, because the swarm does not need to cut one road. The swarm makes every road dangerous at every kilometer at all hours. There's no rerouting around a threat that exists everywhere within 150 kilometers of the line. The Russian $11 billion investment was a fortress built against the last war. Now let me walk you through the second-order consequences, because this is where the situation becomes not just a military problem for Moscow, but a state-level problem. There are approximately 1.5 million people inside the Russian-occupied zone south of the Dnipro and across Crimea. That figure includes occupation administrators, transferred Russian civilians, surviving Ukrainian residents under occupation, and, critically, the the bulk of Russia's southern grouping of forces. Estimates of the military component range from 150,000 to 200,000 personnel, with associated armor, artillery, air defense, and naval infantry. Every one of those soldiers eats. Every vehicle drinks. Every air defense battery requires missile resupply. Every command post requires fresh communications equipment to replace what jamming and counterjamming has burned through. And every kilogram of that sustainment must travel through a corridor that is now under continuous intelligent and adaptive interdiction. The Kerch Bridge cannot save them. The Kerch Bridge has been struck repeatedly, including in 2022, in 2023, in the 2025 incident that Wikipedia and ABC News documented, and most recently damaged by storm and follow-on operations in January 2026, according to reporting from Intent.Press. Civilian rail traffic has been intermittently suspended. Vladimir Saldo, the Russian-installed occupation governor of Kherson Oblast, publicly acknowledged the suspension of traffic on segments of the M14. When the occupation authorities themselves announce that the supply lines are broken, you do not need a satellite to confirm the situation. This is the moment where mainstream analysis fails. The pundit class will say the Russians can simply switch to rail. The pundit class is wrong. Rail through occupied Ukraine runs along the same geographic corridor as the highways, through the same exposed steppe, across the same bridges and culverts, all of which sit within the same Hornet engagement envelope. Rail is in some ways worse. A rail line is a single point of failure that takes weeks to repair, while a road can be cleared in hours. The pundit class will say the Russians can switch to night movement. The Russians have been moving at night for 2 years. It does not help because the Hornet's AI-assisted targeting does not need daylight. The pundit class will say the Russians can build new air defense rings. They have tried. Russian war bloggers themselves are documenting the failure. Rostec has begun showcasing a 30mm counter-drone turret called Citadel with airburst munitions, but the production curve on that system runs into 2027 and beyond. The window for Ukrainian exploitation is open now, And George Barris of the Institute for the Study of War said it plainly in May. Ukraine has, in his words, embridi and chi a marginal upper hand in terms of technology and drone innovation. And chi and bro. When Barris used the word marginal in the Washington analytic vocabulary, he means decisive. And it gets even more serious from here. Pull the lens back to the operational level, because this is the climax of the case study, and it is the part that future doctrine manuals will study for decades. On the night of May 26th into the early morning of May 27th, Ukrainian Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov used a single phrase to describe the campaign on his official channel. He called it a logistics lockdown. That was not rhetoric. That was a deliberate operational announcement telegraphed at the political level that the campaign had moved from harassment to interdiction to systemic denial. In military terminology, denial means the enemy cannot use the asset. Fedorov was publicly declaring that the Russian rear in occupied Ukraine no longer functioned as a rear, and critically, he did so on the same week that the 412th Nemesis Brigade announced the R-280 was blocked, on the same week that Oko Gora published the 60 truck count, and on the same week that the Institute for the Study of War published its analysis declaring that Ukraine's intermediate-range strike campaign, combined with new mechanized attacks, heralded the start of a new phase of the war. That convergence is not a coincidence. That is what a coordinated strategic transition looks like when a military and a political leadership are operating from a shared doctrinal page. The Russian command, by contrast, is improvising in real time. Russian war bloggers are openly complaining. Russian occupation administrators are publicly announcing route suspensions. Russian convoy commanders are trying to drive across plowed fields to escape engagement envelopes that the Ukrainians anticipated weeks ago. That is not the behavior of an army that controls its rear. That is the behavior of an army that has lost the initiative at the operational level and has not yet admitted it to itself. History will record this moment with brutal clarity. The Russian Federation invaded Ukraine in 2022 on the premise that mass, geography, and time were on its side. By 2026, Ukraine has inverted every one of those advantages. Mass has been neutralized by precision. Geography has been neutralized by range. Time has been neutralized by industrial drone production that scales faster than Russian counter-drone development. The Landbridge, the the physical, geographic, political symbol of Russian conquest of southern Ukraine, has become the largest single targeting environment in the modern history of warfare. And the 1.5 million people living inside it, including the soldiers who are supposed to be defending it, are now dependent on a logistics network that the Ukrainian unmanned systems forces have publicly committed to dismantling, kilometer by kilometer, truck by truck, day by day. The broader lesson here is not about Ukraine. It is not about Russia. It is about what modern war has become and what every defense ministry on the planet is now studying with sudden urgency. The era of secure rear areas is over. The era in which mass armies could be sustained by trucks moving freely through their own occupied zones is over. The era in which expensive aircraft were required to conduct deep interdiction is over. A country with a determined engineering base, Starlink connectivity, and a doctrine of distributed precision can now do to a continental army what only the United States Air Force could do 30 years ago. That is the case study. That is the pattern. That is what just happened on the R-280. So where does this go from here? The honest answer is that the next 90 days will determine whether Ukraine can convert this operational advantage into a strategic outcome. If Kiev can sustain the interdiction tempo, if the Hornet production curve continues to climb, if more brigades acquire the new strike wings, if Russian counter-drone systems remain stuck in prototype, then the Russian southern grouping will face a choice no commander wants to make. Withdraw under fire across degraded supply lines or remain in position and degrade in place. Both options are catastrophic. Both options end with the political question Moscow has spent 4 years refusing to answer. If the Russians develop effective countermeasures faster than Ukraine can scale the campaign, if the Citadel system reaches mass production sooner than expected, if Russian electronic warfare adapts to Starlink-stabilized comms, if Moscow successfully isolates the manufacturing nodes inside Ukraine, then the window closes and the war returns to attrition. That is the race. That is the actual strategic question underneath the headlines. But understand what has already been settled. The myth of the secure Russian rear is dead. The myth of the $11 billion land bridge is dead. The myth that distance protects an occupying army is dead. Those facts will not be undone by any countermeasure, any negotiation, any future shift in the war. The doctrine has been proven in combat. The case study has been written in burning fuel tankers on the R-280, and every defense planner from Warsaw to Taipei to Washington is reading it right now. This is the strategic forecast I will leave you with. Watch the next 30 days closely. Watch whether the Russian command attempts a partial withdrawal from the most exposed sectors of occupied Zaporizhia. Watch whether civilian rail traffic on the Kerch Bridge is suspended again. Watch whether the occupation administration in Melitopol begins evacuating non-essential personnel. Those are the indicators that the logistics lockdown is producing strategic effect. And watch the language coming out of Moscow, because when the Kremlin begins talking about defending Crimea rather than expanding from it, you will know that the verdict on the land bridge has been delivered not by analysts, but by the Russian General Staff itself. I will continue to track this campaign in detail in the days ahead, because the indicators are shifting almost hourly, and the next phase of this war is being written on roads that did not exist on a Russian planner's map 2 years ago. If you want to follow this with me, if you want the analysis that does not wait for the cable channels to catch up, if you want to understand the doctrinal logic underneath the headlines, subscribe to the channel. We are building this audience toward a goal, and every subscriber moves the work forward and lets me dig deeper into the operational evidence behind every update. Stay with me, because the questions raised by the collapse of the Russian land bridge do not have simple answers, and the next few weeks will determine which of them get answered first.